So if we want to think scientifically about cooking, we have to start by thinking a little bit about what food is made out of, because after all, it is the constituents of food which will be the major player in this adventure that we're about to launch ourselves on. So to find out what food is made of, it's very simple. You can go and look at any food label that exists on your shelf in your pantry, and just go and examine the food label and see what it says the food is made of. And so what you see when you look at a food label is that there tend to be three major components that are listed. There are fats, there are carbohydrates, and there are proteins. So each of these components, which are words that you've, I'm sure, known about for a long time, and if you're interested in calorie content and calorie consumption or about energy usage, then you're of course very concerned about the relative roles these components play in your human health. But from the point of view of cooking, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates have very different properties. And what we want to do now is just go through and describe each of them to you in a little bit of detail, both to give you a summary of what we're going to be studying in this class and to get you to start to think about the way that the different components of foods play a role in how you cook. So let's just start with the very basic fact, which is that all of us and all of our food are made of molecules. We're made of molecules. We are biological entities. The food that we eat is also biological entities. It tends to come from plants or animals. And all of us and all of our food is made of molecules. Now, there are simple molecules. There's the molecules that's in the air around us. There's, for example, carbon dioxide. There's oxygen. There's water. These are simple molecules. They, of course, themselves are composed of atoms. So carbon dioxide is composed of carbon and oxygen. Water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen, and so on. Food molecules are more complex than atoms, and they're also more complex than simple molecules. The molecules of cooking, namely fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, tend to be much larger molecules which themselves also contain atoms such as carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and so on. And one of the unusual things about cooking is that the basic molecules of food, the basic fats, the basic sugars that we will talk about, tend to form very large networks, or sort of agglomerated structures, which are what make up the structure of food, and also, actually, for that matter, of us. So, for example, if you were to squeeze your finger like this, right, you can see the little fleshy part of your finger. It actually is made of simple molecules, but in order to be so squishy, those simple molecules must have arranged themselves in a rather unusual way. So, and we will talk about that to some extent as we go through this class. Now, what I want to do now is go through the three major components, fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, one at a time, and just tell you a little bit about their properties. So let's just start with fats. So fats are very common. You eat fats, on a daily basis. So examples of common fats that you might eat with include olive oil, coconut oil, cocoa butter, shortening, corn oil, different things like this. And fat has, sort of two features that I would like to highlight right now to get you to start to think about it as a group of molecules. So the first is that fats can either be in liquid or in solid form at room temperature. So at room temperature, for example, a glass of olive oil is a liquid. You can pour it, you can pour it on things. You can use it to make salad dressing. You can use it in various ways. On the other hand, coconut oil is actually a solid at room temperature. It's a white solid mass that if you take a piece of and put it on the countertop, it will retain its shape. And indeed, there are fats that are liquids. There are fats that are solids at room temperature. And we will talk about the physics of this as we go further in this course. But this is sort of one of the unusual features that fats have. So the second feature of fats is also something that you've all experienced, which is that fats don't dissolve in water. That's why when you try to make salad dressing and you mix oil and water, for example, olive oil and water, you will notice that the olive oil does not actually mix itself in the water. Indeed, even if you take your bottle of olive oil and water and shake it up rapidly, they will, if you let it sit for a while on the countertop, separate into the oil being on top and the water being beneath it. And that is because oil and water don't mix with each other. They, or said differently, oil doesn't dissolve in water. Now, this is sort of one of the defining features of oil, and it is very different than the two other major components of food. So now let's talk a little bit about carbohydrates. So carbohydrates consist basically of sugars, sucrose, the sweet taste that you tend to eat if you're trying to eat something sweet, and also chains of sugars, which are starches, or sort of longer chain sugars. These are the sort of two main types of carbohydrates that exist in your food. So either sugars or sugar chains. Now, sugars actually have their own interesting properties. So one property of sugar, which at least I find interesting, is that sugar is really a very hard substance. That is, if you try to crush it, a solid sugar, a piece of sugar, it's very difficult to do. So for example, imagine taking rock candy. Rock candy is really a solid. It doesn't squish at all. Compare that to either your skin, or to Jell-O or to something like that, which tends to be squishy. Sugar is very hard, and this hardness, as we will discover in this class, is a property of the molecules that make it up. So the other thing which is interesting about sugar is that sugar dissolves very well in water. And so if you don't believe me, then go consider for yourself, in fact, consider for yourself right now, how much sugar there is in that glass of soda you drank last week. There can be quite a bit of sugar actually dissolved in water. And in fact, it turns out that the amount of sugar that you can dissolve in 1 pound of water when you're at about room temperature is 2 pounds. So if you don't believe me, then go to your kitchen right now, stop this video, go to your kitchen and do the following experiment. Fill for yourself, one of those measuring cups with about a cup of water, and then fill another measuring cup with a cup of sugar. Pour the sugar in the water, stir it up, and you will find that the sugar all dissolves. Then pour another cup of sugar in your measuring cup. Pour it in the sugar water mixture and mix it again, and you will see that it's still in fact dissolves. The solubility limit of sugar is 2 pounds per pound, and that's really a sort of remarkable property of sugars. So as I said, actually the other main type of carbohydrate are starches, and starches are what we call polymers, that is chains of sugar molecules. So what you do is you take simple sugar molecules like glucose or sucrose and you put them together in long chains, and those chains are what makes up starches. So examples include, for example, amylose, which is a polymer of glucose monomers. So you take a bunch of glucose monomers and stick them together end by end to make a long chain, and that makes up amylose. Or there is what people call amylopectin, which is the same thing, except instead of being a linear chain-like polymer, it's actually branched. So there are branches of polymer that are coming off of it in different ways. And if you use your imagination, on a drawing pad that you might have handy, you can imagine lots of different conformations of polymers, of sugar monomers, and indeed these are the sorts of things that happen in carbohydrates. So in this course, many of our chefs will introduce you to new molecules, like, for example, agar. Farron Adria is a great fan of agar. There's pectin, there's guar gum, there's methylcellulose, there's gelin, there's xanthan gum. There's a huge host of molecules which all are actually carbohydrates. Now, these are actually, although their name might sound peculiar, these are naturally occurring carbohydrates in the same way that flour is a naturally occurring carbohydrates. They're just made in different ways. So whereas flour is made from wheat, by milling and grinding wheat, guar gum actually comes from plants. Pectin is extracted from plants. Methylcellulose, which at some point in this class we will talk about as a way to make hot ice cream, also comes from plants. Agar comes from seaweeds. Gelin and xanthan gum come from microbes. And there's a whole host of different molecules that are made by organisms on our planet that we can use, and we do use as part of our foods. And we will see in the course of this class that, that remarkable things can be made when you enlarge the set of molecules that's at your disposal. So now I want to turn to the third major component of food, which is proteins. So proteins, of course, occur in many of the things that you eat. So for example, if you look at a piece of steak, the red color in steak comes from hemoglobin, at least in part, which is a protein constituent of blood. So milk actually has a protein in it that is called casein. Albumin is a protein component of eggs, which is the thing that is responsible really for the remarkable properties of eggs when you heat and you cook them. This is something that we will talk about extensively in this class. And proteins, when considered as a molecule, have their own interesting property, which is distinct from that of either fats or carbohydrates, and that is the following. So proteins dissolve in water. That's the same as carbohydrates. But what proteins do that is different is that when you heat up water, or you heat up the protein by a relatively small amount, say, 100 degrees Celsius, or 50 degrees Celsius even is often enough, you can get the protein to change conformation. The protein is an active molecule. It doesn't keep the same shape as you cook it. And indeed, it is the changes in shape and configuration of proteins that arguably are really at the heart of most of cooking when you apply heat or other means, as we will again see throughout this class. So what is a protein? So a protein is also a polymer. It's a polymer in the same way that the starch molecules that I described before are polymers, except in this case, instead of the monomers all being identical, for example, being a glucose or a simple sugar molecule, proteins are polymers of amino acids. And it turns out that there are 20 different types of amino acids that compose the proteins that are part of life as we know it. And these 20 amino acids, these 20 monomers themselves have different physical properties. Some of them dissolve in water, some of them don't dissolve in water. Some of them have electric charge, some of them don't have electric charge. And as we go through this class, we will start to see how the different components of proteins give rise to the transformations that occur when we cook them. Now, it turns out that if you take proteins and you put them in water, for example, there are proteins in the white of an egg and also the yolk of an egg, which is mainly filled with water. The proteins tend to be, at least initially, in a state in which the long strand is actually folded into a clump. Proteins, so that is, the long polymer actually exists as a clump. And what happens when you cook a protein, when you heat a protein, is that the long strand tends to unfold into a long, extensible polymer. So one can unfold, and much of cooking, it turns out, is related to the transformation in which a protein in a given food is actually extended into a long polymer. And when it does that, then it turns out that the polymers, that is, the different proteins that are in the food, tend to stick to each other, and they sort of coagulate, and you form a gelatinous mass. And that process, the changing of a protein from a compact shape to a big gelatinous mass of many proteins interacting, is, at the heart of cooking an egg. It's at the heart of making Jell-O. It's at the heart of many of the food transformations that we will see in this class. And these can occur, as we will see, both by applying heat or by applying changes in pH, by actually using acid, be it lemon juice or vinegar, or by changing the salt concentration. And so these are the various knobs that are at play with proteins when you cook.